They say you can judge a person by how they treat those they think are beneath them. And in the world of Summit Industries, nobody spared a second glance at Grace Harper, the black cleaning lady in her worn-out uniform. With her head lowered and her rough hands gripping the cleaning cart, she was nothing more than a shadow, a fixture in the halls of power in downtown Boston. The executives walked past her like she didn't exist, their eyes fixed on their polished shoes, too busy to notice someone they deemed unworthy. But the truth was, Grace had been watching them all along. And today was the day everything would change. It was just another Tuesday morning, until David Parker, one of Summit's top executives, spotted Grace quietly wiping the glass windows in the conference room. Without hesitation, he sneered. "Make sure you don't leave streaks this time," he barked, his tone dripping with arrogance. "Some of us have real work to do in here." His words weren't just condescending, they were meant to wound. His self-satisfied smirk barely concealed the disdain in his voice. And as always, the room filled with the soft snickers of his colleagues, who found it amusing to mock the cleaning lady. To them, Grace wasn't a person, she was furniture, just another invisible object in the room, expected to clean up and disappear. Grace said nothing, her face as impassive as ever. But inside, she felt the weight of every word, every sneer, every glance that dismissed her. They didn't know it yet, but that arrogant laugh would soon come back to haunt them all. Among the sea of indifference in Summit Industries, there was one person who noticed more than most, Emily Carter, a new hire fresh out of business school. Unlike her seasoned colleagues, Emily hadn't yet become desensitized to the office dynamics. She often observed how the higher-ups treated Grace with casual cruelty, and it bothered her deeply. Emily watched the way Grace walked through the halls, not with the hunched shoulders of someone beaten down by life, but with a quiet dignity. Something about Grace felt different. The way her eyes lingered on the boardroom during those executive meetings, as if she wasn't just cleaning but observing, really watching. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that Grace saw more than anyone else did in this polished, soulless environment. She had her suspicions, but she couldn't place why. Still, something told her that the cleaning lady was far more than met the eye. The air in Summit Industries shifted the moment Henry Caldwell, the formidable CEO, walked through the door. His presence alone was enough to command absolute silence. Conversations died mid-sentence, and eyes nervously darted to their watches. Henry wasn't just any CEO. He was a man known for his razor-sharp instincts and ruthless drive. He had taken Summit to the top of the corporate ladder, and no one dared question his decisions. As he strode confidently toward the boardroom for the highly anticipated annual review, the entire office buzzed with anticipation. He was a figure to be respected, feared, admired, all at once. But as Henry entered the glass-walled conference room, something unexpected happened. His sharp gaze landed directly on Grace Harper, standing quietly in the corner with her cleaning supplies. For a brief, electrifying moment, it was as if the room itself held its breath. Then, to everyone's astonishment, Henry smiled, warmly. "Grace," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I think it's time, don't you?" The board members exchanged bewildered glances. David Parker, who had mocked Grace earlier, froze, the smug grin wiped clean from his face. He stared at Henry, then at Grace, his mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. Grace calmly set down the rag in her hand. There was no rush in her movements. Every action was deliberate, controlled. With a quiet authority that had been there all along, hidden beneath the surface, she straightened her posture and turned to face the executives. "Yes, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice steady, her eyes unwavering. The time had come. The boardroom was filled with confusion, eyes darting between Henry Caldwell and Grace Harper. David Parker sat motionless, his brain refusing to process what had just unfolded. Had the CEO, the most powerful man in the building, just called the cleaning lady by name? And with such warmth? Henry, standing tall at the head of the table, let the tension build, glancing briefly around the room before turning back to the executives. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice as steady and commanding as ever, "it's time for a change. I'd like to introduce you all to Grace Harper, Summit's majority shareholder." A collective gasp echoed through the room. Papers rustled, and jaws dropped in disbelief. For a moment, the silence was deafening, as if the very walls were absorbing the shock. Grace, who had been standing in the corner for years, suddenly became the center of the universe. Emily Carter's heart raced as she tried to grasp the magnitude of what had just happened. David, meanwhile, was frozen, his face drained of color, his mind racing through every dismissive comment he had ever made about Grace. Grace walked slowly to the front of the room, no longer the invisible cleaner. She now held every ounce of power in her hands, her quiet strength radiating through the room. "For years," she began, her voice calm but laced with authority, "I've watched how this company operates, from the ground up. Not from behind a desk, but from the floors you walk on, the hallways you pass through, and the offices you leave in disarray. And what I've seen is a culture that prioritizes profits over people, a culture that lacks basic respect." Every executive, once smug and untouchable, now sat rigid, their eyes wide with disbelief. Grace's presence had transformed. She was no longer a mere bystander, she was their leader. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood one thing: everything was about to change. Grace stood tall at the front of the room, her eyes sweeping across the faces of the stunned executives. These were the same people who had treated her as invisible for years, the same ones who had looked down on her because of the uniform she wore. But today, that uniform was no longer a symbol of servitude, it was a badge of resilience. "For years," she began, her voice calm but filled with conviction, "I've worked quietly observing. I've seen how this company operates, not just from behind a desk, but from the floors you walk on, from the places you never bother to look. I've cleaned up the messes you've left behind, both literal and figurative. But now, I'm no longer just cleaning up your physical messes. Today, I'm cleaning up this company." A murmur rippled through the room, but no one dared speak. Grace's presence was undeniable, her words carrying the weight of someone who had seen the company for what it truly was. "You've created a culture here," she continued, her gaze locking with David Parker's for a brief second, "where profits come before people. Where respect is given based on position, not character. But that ends today." There was a pause, one that felt like an eternity, as the executives absorbed her words. Emily Carter, standing near the back, couldn't help but smile slightly. This was the moment she had felt coming all along. Grace's eyes softened, but her tone remained firm. "Moving forward, this company will value everyone. From the boardroom to the cleaning staff, respect will no longer be a luxury, it will be a requirement. If anyone here can't adapt to that, then feel free to leave." Her final words hung in the air like a verdict. The once untouchable executives now seemed small, humbled by the very woman they had ignored for so long. The silence that followed Grace's words hung heavy in the air. Every executive in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but none more so than David Parker. His mind raced, trying to grasp what had just happened. Grace Harper, the woman he had sneered at, dismissed, and mocked without a second thought, she was the one who held his fate in her hands now. He swallowed hard, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as if to steady himself in a world that had suddenly become unfamiliar. The smirk that had once graced his face was long gone, replaced by a look of sheer disbelief. How could he have been so blind? So arrogant? David could feel the stares of his colleagues boring into him, but for the first time, he had no words. He had spent years at Summit Industries, climbing the corporate ladder, cutting down anyone who stood in his way. He was known for his ruthless ambition, his ability to charm the board while leaving a trail of broken careers behind him. Yet here he was, facing the consequences of his arrogance. Finally, he mustered the courage to speak. His voice was shaky, uncertain. "Miss Harper, I didn't know. I had no idea." Grace's eyes, cold and piercing, locked onto his. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her authority was in the silence between her words. "No, David," she said calmly. "You didn't care to know. You saw me every day, but you never saw me. You didn't bother to ask who I was or why I was here. All you saw was a uniform, and you thought that told you everything." David's heart sank. He knew where this was going, but he wasn't ready to face it. His hands trembled as he tried to keep his composure. "Please," he stammered. "I didn't mean to." Grace's expression didn't change. Her voice remained steady, almost detached. "That's the problem, David. You never meant anything you said to me, or to anyone else here who wasn't in your circle. But now, the time has come for accountability." There was a pause, a long, drawn-out silence that felt like it could break him. Grace looked directly into his eyes, her tone unwavering. "You're fired, David. Effective immediately." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. For a second, it felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. Fired? Him? The very idea seemed impossible, but there it was, final, irrefutable. The room erupted into hushed murmurs as the weight of Grace's decision settled over everyone present. David sat frozen, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair as if they could somehow anchor him in this new, terrifying reality. The same man who had spent years manipulating, dismissing, and outmaneuvering everyone around him had just lost everything in a matter of minutes. His career, his status, his identity, it all vanished with a single, undeniable sentence. Grace didn't linger. She had nothing more to say to David. Her decision had been made, and there was no turning back. As she turned her attention to the rest of the board, David remained seated, his mind reeling. He was no longer in control, and it terrified him. Every sneer, every insult, every dismissive gesture flashed before his eyes, and he realized too late just how blind he had been to his own downfall. As David Parker sat, his world unraveling before him, Grace turned her attention to the rest of the board. The once confident executives, men and women who had spent years in positions of power, now looked at her with a mix of fear and respect. The reality was sinking in. The rules of Summit Industries had changed, and they were no longer the untouchables they once believed themselves to be. Grace let the silence linger, her gaze moving deliberately from one face to another. Every pair of eyes that met hers quickly darted away, as if they could somehow escape the weight of her words. But there was no escape. "Let me be clear," she began, her voice unwavering, cutting through the tension like a blade. "The culture of arrogance and disregard that has thrived here for too long ends today. Moving forward, Summit will be a company that values its people, not just its profits." Her words hung in the air, each one hitting with the force of truth. No one dared to speak. The room that once buzzed with self-assured voices was now filled with uncertainty. "If any of you," Grace continued, "find that you can't adapt to this new reality, if respect and fairness are foreign concepts to you, then consider this your invitation to leave. Because from now on, things will be different." The finality of her statement echoed, and with that, Grace had set the new standard. The message was clear. Change was inevitable, and those who couldn't follow would be left behind. As the tension in the room began to settle, Grace Harper allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The quiet power she had wielded today wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring dignity. She had stood in the shadows for too long, watching a culture of disrespect flourish, but now, things were different. Turning slightly, her gaze met Henry Caldwell, the man who had believed in her when no one else did. He hadn't just seen a cleaning lady, he had seen her potential, her strength. In this moment of triumph, Grace knew she owed him more than just professional respect, she owed him gratitude. "Thank you, Henry," she said, her voice softer now, yet filled with sincerity. "For believing in me when no one else did." Henry smiled, a rare warmth in his eyes. "It's easy to believe in someone who's as strong and determined as you," he replied. "Summit needed a leader like you, Grace, someone who understands what it means to work for something, to earn it." Grace nodded, her heart swelling with pride, but also with a deep sense of responsibility. She wasn't just changing Summit for herself, she was changing it for everyone who had ever been overlooked, disrespected, or undervalued. This was only the beginning. As Grace stepped out of the boardroom, the weight of the moment still hung in the air. Behind her, the once untouchable executives sat in stunned silence, their world forever changed by the woman they had dismissed for so long. She walked down the polished hallways of Summit Industries with a newfound confidence, her every step now carrying the authority she had always possessed but never shown. Beside her, Emily Carter hurried to catch up, her heart still racing from the events that had unfolded. "Miss Harper," Emily called, her voice filled with awe and respect. "I just wanted to say, thank you. For everything." Grace paused, turning to face the young woman. There was a softness in her expression, but her words carried the wisdom of someone who had fought for every inch of her success. "You don't have to thank me, Emily," Grace said with a smile. "Just remember this, never let anyone define your worth. That's something only you can decide." Emily nodded, her admiration for Grace deepening. In this brief exchange, she felt as though she had learned more than all her years in business school could have taught her. Grace had shown her that true power comes from within, and that it could be claimed, no matter where you started. As Grace stepped outside, the city of Boston stretched out before her, tall buildings, bustling streets, and endless possibilities. The skyline that had once seemed so distant now felt different. This was not just a city of glass and steel anymore. It was a place where anyone, no matter their background, could rise to the top if they had the strength to persevere. And as for Summit Industries, they would never forget the day they laughed at Grace Harper, the cleaning lady who, it turned out, owned it all.